Hello everybody, it's Mr. G and welcome back to Misconceptions in History. And today we are continuing our series on the final battleships. Now last time I talked about the Bismarck. This time I'm going to be talking about kind of the lesser known of the final battleships, which is known as the Vanguard class battleships. And these were the last British battleships. Now I didn't do this last time, but I really wanted to get the perspective of the Vanguard in regard to the final four that we're talking about. The Bismarck, the Iowa, Yamato, and Vanguard classes. And while the Vanguard was actually the smallest of these four final battleships that we were discussing, it was actually one of the fastest. And interestingly enough, because its development occurred over the course of World War II, it was actually designed to combat the threats that occurred, especially anti-air, better than its contemporaries. Sadly, unlike the other three, because of its continuous stop and start and development, it didn't actually see action until after World War II had concluded. But let's go ahead and see how the British managed to develop the Vanguard-class battleships. Now, when we talk about battleship development, we have to acknowledge that the British are the ones who created the design of the battleship that became popular. They created the Dreadnought, the design which all battleships are based on. And even their later designs, like the Revenge class, which was a super dreadnought, influenced later battleship development. And the British were actually on the cusp of another radical battleship design, which is known as the N3 class battleship. And as you're looking at this, to me, the ship looks more almost like an oil tanker combined with a battleship. And the idea was for a greater range battleship that was supposed to be part of a new series known as the 8-8 fleet, 8 battleships, 8 cruisers, and was going to radicalize everything for battleship development. But of course, our friend the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 changed everything again. And while the British weren't as heavily of a victim of the Washington Naval Treaty as, say, the Germans, the Italians, or the British were, they did hurt. And they actually had to cancel several series of battleships, including the N3. Now, the Nelson class was one of the few battleships that any nation developed during the time period of the Washington Naval Treaty. And this was a radical design. The British continue their changes and revolutionary designs in battleship development. And the Nelson's big thing is that all of its main batteries were placed forward on the ship. It used 3 triple turrets of 16-inch guns, which was relatively new at the time. Most ships were still using 15-inchers. And this design was essentially built to skirt around a lot of the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, but still allow the British to maintain a sense of power. Now, when the limitations ended, the British were able to build the King George V class. And this was actually the premier battleship for the British. And honestly, with all the work and developments that came along with the King George V, I need to do a video on just it and sometime in the future, maybe a brief 2-3 minute video about it. Now, there are 5 battleships of the King George V class, and only one was actually sunk in combat, the Prince of Wales, which was sunk by the Japanese on December 10th, 1941, right after the Pearl Harbor attack. The rest served with distinction throughout World War II. And so the design actually worked so well, they came up with the Lion class. And the Lion class was essentially just an upgraded King George V class. And essentially they took the King George V class and enlarged it, placed heavier anti-aircraft abilities. And there was even plans to possibly convert them into a hybrid battleship aircraft carrier later on in the war. They actually built 2 of these and they ended up being scrapped because they didn't have time to complete them. So instead of building the Lion class, they built the Vanguard class. And even though it's called the Vanguard class, they only built one ship, and that was the HMS Vanguard. And they basically took a Lion class battleship, which of course was the improvement of the King George V class. They removed the 16-inch turrets because they didn't have time to actually manufacture 16-inch guns, and they had a ton of 15-inch guns in storage and replaced the 16s on the design with 15s. They improved the engine performance, making it much faster. In fact, the fastest British battleship. Now, sadly, the Vanguard actually wouldn't be completed until 1946, until after World War II was completed. And this was basically the result of, the constant fighting occurring with England and Germany, and production being slowed, and the need for materials. They just couldn't build it in time. Now, it did serve from 1946 until 1960 when it was decommissioned. And during its short career, it did participate in multiple NATO operations, training exercises and such, and was part of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation review. However, by the end of the 50s, like so many other battleships, they were kind of just being considered obsolete. The British didn't see a need for it anymore and wanted to focus its assets elsewhere. And sadly, that would pretty much be the end of its career. Decommissioned in 1960, and later that year it would be sold for scrap. And there you have it, a brief history of the Vanguard class battleship, a battleship that had so much potential but really came too late and had a very quiet career before it was essentially scrapped, as so many battleships of its time were being. So that's it for today. I thank you for joining me on the Vanguard class battleship. Next time we will talk about the battleship Yamato and how we got to one of the largest battleships ever built. So thank you, and I look forward to talking to y'all the next time.